I've stayed in all kinds of motels over the years, from the cozy and charming to the rundown and questionable. But there's one motel I stayed at a few years ago that I'll never forget. It was a small, isolated place off a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. I didn't plan on stopping there, but after driving for hours with no sign of civilization, I didn't have much choice. I just needed a place to rest for the night. What I found instead was a nightmare that still haunts me. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before calling it a night, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through miles of empty fields and forests. The headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness, and the occasional signpost or abandoned barn was the only indication that I was still on the right path. When I finally saw the flickering neon sign for the motel, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much, a small, single-story building with a handful of rooms, a few old cars parked out front, and a faded sign that read vacancy in dim, sputtering letters. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, with paint peeling off the walls and grimy, cracked windows. But I was too tired to care. I just needed a place to sleep, somewhere to rest my head before continuing my journey in the morning. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching under the car as I parked. The air was cold, the sky overcast, and a faint mist hung in the air, clinging to everything like a damp shroud. The only light came from the neon sign and a single bulb above the motel's entrance, casting an eerie yellow glow on the worn-out pavement. I grabbed my bag and headed inside, the door creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. The lobby was small and dingy, with faded wallpaper and a few outdated brochures scattered on a dusty counter. Behind the counter sat an old man, his eyes barely visible behind thick, smudged glasses. He looked up as I entered, his expression blank and almost indifferent. "Need a room," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The old man didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger, flipping it open to a blank page. His hand shook slightly as he handed me a pen. "Sign here," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. I scribbled my name in the ledger and handed it back to him. He didn't even glance at it, just shoved it aside and reached for a key hanging on a hook behind the counter. "Room 6, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "No smoking, no pets." "Got it," I replied, taking the key. "Thanks." He didn't respond, just stared at me with that same blank expression as I turned and headed back outside. Room 6 was at the far end of the building, next to a thick line of trees that bordered the property. The door was old and chipped, the number barely visible, but the key turned easily enough in the lock. The room inside was about what I expected, small, with a sagging bed, a rickety dresser, and a tiny TV mounted on the wall. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, and the whole place smelled faintly of mildew. But it was warm, and after the long drive it was enough. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, the mattress creaking under my weight. I grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV, but all I got was static. Sighing, I turned it off and glanced around the room, noticing a small door to the side that I assumed led to the bathroom. I walked over and pushed it open, revealing a cramped, outdated bathroom with a cracked mirror and a flickering overhead light. After freshening up, I changed into some sweats and crawled into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the highway. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and closed my eyes, trying to let the exhaustion of the day take over. But sleep didn't come easily. The darkness felt oppressive, the silence too complete, as if the world outside the room had ceased to exist. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at the back of my mind. Something about the motel, about the old man behind the counter, about the whole place felt wrong. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside the room. It was a faint noise, like something gently tapping against the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch from one of the nearby trees brushing against the door. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It wasn't random, it was intentional. A chill ran down my spine, and my hands shook as I reached for the lamp. The light flickered on, and I stared at the door, my heart pounding. The sound still echoed in my ears. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to see what was causing the noise, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I did. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But I didn't. I reached the door and placed my hand on the cold doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before turning it and pulling the door open. The night air rushed in, cold and damp, but there was nothing there. Just the empty parking lot, the gravel gleaming faintly in the light of the distant neon sign. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my feet, and looked around. The mist hung low to the ground, making everything look ghostly and unreal. There was no one there, no sign of anything or anyone that could have made the sound. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it really was just the wind, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. I was about to turn back to the room when I noticed something, a single footprint in the gravel, just a few feet from the door. It wasn't mine. The print was large, the outline clear in the mist-covered gravel, and it led away from the room, disappearing into the line of trees at the edge of the property. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly retreated back into the room, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I pressed my back against the door, my mind racing. Someone had been out there standing just outside my room. But where had they gone? And why were they just standing there tapping on the door? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just some weirdo messing around, maybe one of the other guests playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something off about the whole situation, something that made my skin crawl. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, but there was no way I was going to sleep now. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door, the hours seeming to stretch on forever. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it again. This time it was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The window was right next to the bed, covered by a thin curtain that barely blocked out the light. The sound was soft, almost like someone gently tapping on the glass with their fingernails. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was out there. But the sound continued, persistent, rhythmic, like it was trying to draw me closer, trying to get me to look. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets over my head like a child hiding from a monster under the bed. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, that if I stayed still, stayed quiet, it would go away. But the tapping didn't stop. The room felt like a prison, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I couldn't just lie there and do nothing. With a trembling hand, I reached out and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to look, to see what was outside the window. I slowly pulled the blankets down, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. I shone the flashlight at the window, the beam casting a faint glow on the thin curtain. I could see a vague shape behind it, something standing just outside the glass, barely visible. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out with my free hand, gripping the edge of the curtain. I hesitated for just a moment, then yanked it aside, the flashlight beam illuminating the window. There was nothing there. No figure, no face, no sign of anything that could have been making the noise. Just the empty parking lot, the mist swirling in the faint light of the neon sign. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. I was about to close the curtain when I noticed something small, barely visible in the corner of the window. A handprint, smudged and faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back from the window, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I grabbed my keys, my bag, anything I could reach, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about checking out, didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. Finally, I managed to wrench it open and ran out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in the car, the engine roaring to life as I tore out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for hours, the lights of civilization finally bringing some semblance of safety. I found a motel there, one that was clean and well lit, and checked in without a second thought. But even then, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that handprint in my mind, kept hearing that soft, rhythmic tapping. I never found out what happened that night, never went back to that motel to find out who or what was outside my room. I've told a few people about it, but most just laugh it off, say it was probably just my imagination or some prankster messing with me. But I know what I heard, what I saw. And I know that whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. I've spent a lot of time on the road since then, stayed in a lot of motels, but I always make sure to find a place that's well lit, that's near other people. And I never ever stop at some lonely, isolated place in the middle of nowhere. Because out there in the darkness, in the silence, there's something waiting, something that will find you if you're not careful. And once it does, you may never escape. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Share your own creepy encounters in the comments. I'd love to hear what keeps you up at night. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest places are often where you least expect them. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Over the years, my friends and I have explored countless trails and camped in some pretty remote places. But there's one trip we took that none of us will ever forget. A weekend in a cabin deep in the woods, found through some obscure online listing. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts us to this day. The plan was simple. Drive out to this old cabin we rented for next to nothing, spend the weekend hiking, cooking over a campfire, and maybe telling a few ghost stories around the fire. The listing described the cabin as rustic and secluded, which was exactly what we wanted, somewhere to escape the grind of our daily lives. We set out early on Friday, the 5 of us crammed into Aaron's old SUV, laughing and joking as we drove deeper into the countryside. The road wound through small towns and farmlands, then narrowed as we entered the woods, the trees closing in around us like a tunnel. The farther we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. No houses, no power lines, just miles of dense forest. The GPS struggled to keep up, its signal fading out as we ventured further off the beaten path. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old, weathered structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, and the whole place had an air of abandonment, as if it hadn't seen visitors in years. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped out of the car, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just a reaction to the sudden drop in temperature. "Looks cozy," Aaron joked, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all laughed, but it was a nervous laughter, the kind you use to cover up unease. There was something about the cabin that felt off, but none of us wanted to be the one to back out. So we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside, dusty furniture, creaky floorboards, and a musty smell hanging in the air. The kitchen was small, with outdated appliances and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The living room had a few old, mismatched chairs and a threadbare couch, all facing a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A wooden staircase led up to a loft with a couple of small bedrooms. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding like we weren't supposed to be there. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every little noise seem louder than it should be. But I didn't say anything, chalking it up to nerves and the unfamiliar setting. We spent the first evening trying to get settled. Aaron and I got a fire going in the fireplace while the others unpacked and set up the kitchen. We made hot dogs and beans for dinner, the kind of meal that tastes better when you're out in the woods. We ate around the fireplace, the crackling flames the only sound in the cabin. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying tension none of us wanted to acknowledge. After dinner, we decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got too dark. The woods were dense and overgrown, the trees tall and close together, blocking out most of the remaining light. We wandered around, talking about how we should go hiking the next day, maybe even try to find a stream to fish in. But as we moved deeper into the woods, that feeling of unease crept back in. The trees seemed to press in on us, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small clearing and found something that made us stop in our tracks. A cluster of old gravestones, half buried in the earth, their inscriptions worn away by time. There were no signs of any buildings or paths nearby, just these forgotten graves in the middle of the woods. It was unsettling, to say the least, but we tried to laugh it off. "Guess we know why the cabin was so cheap," Sarah said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing like a graveyard to keep the rent low." We didn't stay long. The sun had set, and the darkness was closing in fast. We made our way back to the cabin, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that followed us through the trees. Back at the cabin, we tried to shake off the unease by playing cards and telling stories, but the atmosphere had changed. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the old furniture look even more decrepit. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside made us jumpy. Our nerves were on edge, and it felt like the cabin was watching us. At some point, we heard a faint noise coming from outside, like someone or something moving around the cabin. It was a soft, shuffling sound, almost like footsteps on the dirt. We all froze, the cards forgotten, our eyes darting to the windows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Mark nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, maybe it's just an animal." None of us believed that. The sound was too deliberate, too slow to be an animal. It circled the cabin, pausing every so often, then continuing. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "Maybe we should check it out," Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "No way," Sarah shot back. "We should stay inside. Whatever it is, it'll go away." But the sound didn't go away. It continued, methodically circling the cabin, growing more distinct. It was as if whoever or whatever was outside wanted us to know it was there, wanted us to be afraid. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to see what it is," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Aaron joined me, and together we approached the front door. The others stayed by the fireplace, their faces tense with fear. The air inside was thick with tension, the only sound the relentless footsteps outside. We opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The cold night air hit us like a wall, and the darkness outside felt impenetrable. I shone the flashlight around, the beam sweeping across the trees, the porch, the dirt path leading to the woods. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. Aaron and I exchanged a nervous glance, then stepped outside. The gravel crunched under our feet, but the sound had stopped. The silence was even more unnerving. We walked around the cabin, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, just the endless darkness of the woods. We went back inside, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing, just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, the air thick with an unspoken fear. We sat by the fire a while longer, trying to act normal, but the tension was unbearable. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would take away the unease. We all agreed to sleep in the living room, not wanting to be alone in the small, dark bedrooms upstairs. We set up our sleeping bags around the fireplace, the flickering flames providing the only light in the room. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Every little noise made my heart race, my mind conjuring images of shadows moving just beyond the firelight. I could tell the others were awake too, their breathing quick and shallow, their bodies tense. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time they were coming from above us in the loft. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the wooden floor. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced at Aaron, who was wide-eyed, staring up at the ceiling. "Someone's up there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth as if whoever was up there was searching for something. The floorboards creaked under the weight, loud in the silence of the night. We were paralyzed with fear, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The footsteps moved to the top of the stairs, then paused. There was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and our own panicked breathing. Then, slowly, the footsteps began to descend the stairs. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I knew we had to get out. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. "We need to leave," now I said, my voice shaking. The others didn't need convincing. We scrambled to gather our things, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. The footsteps continued down the stairs, growing closer with every second. We didn't wait to see who or what was coming. We bolted for the door, bursting out into the cold night air. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. Aaron fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but he finally managed to get the door open. We piled in, slamming the doors behind us. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the gravel path, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. We didn't stop until we were miles away, No one spoke, the fear still fresh in our minds. It wasn't until we reached the main road that Aaron finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still pounding, "but I'm not going back to find out." None of us slept that night. We found a cheap motel in the nearest town and huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers, only the lingering fear and the memory of those footsteps coming down the stairs. I've always preferred driving at night. There's something calming about the empty highways, the way the world feels asleep, and the quiet that surrounds you. It's just you, the road, and your thoughts. But that night I wished I hadn't stayed out so late. I had been visiting my sister in a small town a couple of hours from where I live. It wasn't an unusual trip. I'd been making it for years, every few months, to catch up and spend time with her family. But I lost track of time, and before I knew it, it was pushing 1 a.m. when I finally left. The highway was long and empty, just the way I liked it. My headlights stretched out ahead, illuminating the road and the occasional sign. I was cruising along, enjoying the solitude, when I noticed my gas gauge creeping dangerously close to empty. I had forgotten to fill up before leaving my sister's place, and I wasn't exactly in a populated area. The road stretched through vast expanses of fields and woods, with a lone farmhouse appearing here and there amidst the emptiness. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. I flipped on my GPS, hoping to find something nearby, but the nearest station was over 20 minutes away. I looked at the gauge again. There was no way I'd make it that far. I'd have to pull over soon or risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I drove for a few more miles, growing more anxious with each passing minute, until I finally saw a sign, a faded, rusted one, but a sign nonetheless. Gas, it read, with an arrow pointing down a narrow side road branching off from the highway. I hesitated, unsure whether to trust it. It looked like the kind of place that might not even be open this late, but I didn't have much of a choice. I made the turn and followed the road for about 5 minutes before the station came into view. It was one of those old, rundown places you only see in movies. A single pump stood beneath a flickering overhead light, and the small convenience store behind it looked dark, except for the glow of a lone fluorescent bulb inside. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but at least it was something. I pulled up to the pump and turned off the engine. The night was still, eerily quiet. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, and looked around. There was no one there, not a single car. The place looked abandoned, but the pump seemed to be operational, so I swiped my card and started filling up. As the gas flowed into the tank, I found myself glancing toward the convenience store. The inside was dimly lit, but through the dirty windows I could make out a man standing behind the counter. He was staring straight ahead, unmoving. I hadn't noticed him when I first pulled up, but now that I did, something about him seemed off. He didn't move, didn't wave or nod. He just stood there, staring blankly. I tried to ignore the weird feeling creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just late and I was tired. Maybe the guy was zoning out or half asleep. I mean, it must be boring working the night shift at a place like this. Still, I kept stealing glances at him as I waited for the pump to finish. But every time I looked, he was in the exact same position, like he hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the pump clicked, and I put the nozzle back, relieved that I could get out of there. I reached for my wallet to grab some cash and decided to head inside to pay. It felt wrong to leave without acknowledging the guy, even if he seemed a little strange. As I walked toward the convenience store, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about the whole place felt wrong, like I didn't belong there. The closer I got to the door, the heavier the air seemed to feel. I pushed the door open, and the little bell above it jingled, breaking the silence. The man behind the counter still didn't move. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, not even acknowledging that I had entered. Just here to pay for gas," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. No response. I took a few steps closer to the counter, trying to get a better look at him. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with thinning hair and deep wrinkles etched into his face. His skin had an odd grayish tint, like he hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. "Hello?" I called out, waving my hand a little to get his attention. Nothing. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. I took a step back, suddenly wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice. "Long night for driving, isn't it?" I froze. The voice was low, gravelly, and definitely not friendly. Slowly, I turned back around. The man was staring at me now, his eyes cold and unsettling. He hadn't moved from his spot behind the counter, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, I guess," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just heading home." He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who knows something you don't, something you'd rather not know. "Not many people come through here at this hour," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place, especially not alone. One. The way he said alone sent a jolt of fear through me. I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. The station was completely isolated, and there was no one around for miles. "Yeah, well, I'm just passing through," I said, fumbling for my wallet and tossing a few bills on the counter. "Here's for the gas." He didn't move to take the money. Instead, he just kept staring at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Were you headed?" he asked, his voice low and slow. "Home," I repeated, stepping back toward the door. "It's late. I should go." His smile widened, more unsettling this time. "You might want to be careful on these roads," he said. "Lots of accidents out here. People get lost." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned on my heel and practically ran out of the store, the bell jingling faintly behind me as I slammed the door shut. I hurried back to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors, glancing back toward the convenience store. The man was still standing there, watching me through the dirty windows, his smile never fading. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car, pulling out of the gas station as fast as I could. My heart didn't stop racing until I was back on the highway, the station disappearing into the distance behind me. For the next 20 minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road remained empty. The second I began to feel calm again, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, a shadow. I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the darkness and the tiredness settling in. But then I saw it again, a figure sitting in the back seat. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone there, but the back seat was empty. I was alone. No. I turned back to the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired. I was on edge after the weird encounter at the gas station. But the feeling of someone watching me didn't go away. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the sensation. It was as if there was someone or something in the car with me, just out of sight. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but every time I looked, the back seat was empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I sat there for a moment, staring at my quiet house, trying to calm my nerves. The weirdness of the night weighed heavily on me, but at least I was home. I was safe. I turned off the engine, grabbed my bag, and stepped out of the car. That's when I saw it. The man standing at the end of my driveway, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I knew it was him, the man from the gas station. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I blinked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I looked again, he was gone. The driveway was empty. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting for him to reappear. But he didn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I went inside, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night. And for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, months later, the events of that night are still fresh in my memory. I never thought of myself as someone who gets easily rattled. I've lived alone for years, traveled to all sorts of places, and had my fair share of late nights walking through unfamiliar streets. My condo in Fort Lauderdale was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a place where I could unwind, especially after stressful work trips. The building itself was relatively modern, clean, and quiet, which is why I picked it. Most of my neighbors were retirees or snowbirds who only lived there part-time, meaning the place was usually half empty, especially during the off-season. I loved the quiet. I never imagined that the same peace I cherished could turn into something so unsettling. It all started on a Monday night. I had just returned from a weekend trip upstate, exhausted but grateful to be home. I dropped my bags in the entryway, tossed my keys on the counter, and settled into the couch, planning to spend the evening mindlessly flipping through TV channels. Everything felt normal at first. The condo was its usual self, quiet, with the occasional hum of the air conditioning as the only sound breaking the silence. I could hear the faint murmur of waves outside from the nearby beach, a sound that had always calmed me. After watching a few episodes of some forgettable show, I decided to take a break and make a quick dinner. As I stood in the kitchen, waiting for water to boil, I noticed something strange, a faint tapping sound, barely audible over the TV in the background. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living in a condo, you get used to random noises, pipes, wind, maybe a neighbor in the hallway. It could be anything. I went back to stirring the pot, assuming the sound would stop. But it didn't. The tapping continued, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't rhythmic, it sounded more like someone knocking lightly on something or pacing outside my door. I looked toward the hallway. The front door was shut, the deadbolt locked. No reason to worry, I told myself. But the tapping grew louder. I moved toward the door, listening closely, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It sounded like it was just on the other side, as if someone was standing there, tapping against the wood with their fingers. I stopped a few feet from the door and stared at it. Was someone out there? A neighbor, maybe? But it was late, close to midnight, and I hadn't heard anyone in the hall all day. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to open the door or walk away. The tapping stopped. I waited, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. After another minute of silence, I laughed at myself and turned to go back to the kitchen. That's when I heard it, a knock. Not just a faint tap, but a knock, loud, firm, 3 sharp raps against the door. I whipped around, staring at the door, waiting for some explanation to present itself. A neighbor? A package delivery this late at night? It didn't make any sense. I walked slowly to the door, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. No one. The hallway outside was empty. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. Maybe they'd knocked and left. I tried to rationalize it, but it didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off. I sat back down on the couch, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a knock, probably nothing. But the tension in my chest didn't ease. I found myself constantly looking at the door, expecting to hear another knock or see the doorknob turn. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The tension started to fade, and I finally convinced myself it had been a random, harmless occurrence. I went to bed around 2 a.m., still a little on edge but too tired to care anymore. The next day was uneventful, almost to the point where I started to feel stupid for being so worked up. I went about my day as usual, worked from home, went for a run on the beach, came back, showered, and relaxed on the couch again. By evening, the memory of the strange knocking was already fading. I chalked it up to some harmless prank or someone confused about which condo they were visiting. Around midnight, I was getting ready for bed when I heard it again. The knock. Louder this time, more insistent. I froze, my toothbrush still in my mouth, staring at the bathroom door. The knock came again and again. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. I spat out the toothpaste and quickly walked to the front door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, remembering the empty hallway from the night before. But the knocking didn't stop. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see no one again. But this time there was someone. A man stood outside, hunched over, his face too close to the door. His features were hard to make out through the fishy lens, but his expression was unmistakable anger or frustration, like he'd been waiting for hours. He raised his fist and knocked again, harder this time. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. Who was this guy, and what did he want? For a moment, I considered opening the door to confront him, but something held me back, a deep, primal instinct that screamed at me not to. Instead, I stayed silent, hoping he would just go away. But he didn't. He kept knocking louder, angrier. He banged on the door, rattling the frame. Then came his voice, low and gravelly, but I couldn't make out the words. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay calm. Should I call the cops? What if it was just a misunderstanding? But the way he kept knocking, the malice in his voice, made me hesitate. The banging grew louder. He was pounding on the door now, harder and harder, like he was trying to break it down. The wood creaked under the force of his fists, and then, suddenly it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign that he was still out there. But all I heard was silence. I looked through the peephole again. He was gone. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe he'd finally given up. But just as I started to relax, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A scraping sound. It was coming from the door, soft at first, then louder. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. It sounded like metal dragging against the door frame. My heart leaped into my throat. What was he doing? I looked through the peephole again, but all I could see was the man's head too close to the door. The scraping continued. My hands trembled as I backed away. Was he trying to pick the lock? Break in? My chest tightened with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to that sound, frozen in place. Eventually it stopped. I don't know what made him leave. But when I finally had the courage to look through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. I barely slept that night. Every shadow outside my window had me on edge, convinced he was coming back. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, but nothing could shake the feeling that I wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, I reported the incident to the building manager, but they didn't take me seriously. It was probably a drunk or a homeless guy, they said, brushing me off. These things happen sometimes. But I knew better. That man wasn't just some random drunk. He knew what he was doing, and I had a sinking feeling he wasn't done with me yet. For the next week, I lived in a constant state of anxiety. Every night I waited for the knocking to return, but it never did. I started to think maybe it was over, that maybe the guy had moved on. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. Then one evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, sitting in the lobby of the building, was the man from the hallway. He was sitting on one of the benches, staring blankly ahead, as if waiting for something from me. Our eyes met, and for a split second, I thought about confronting him. But then that same primal instinct kicked in, telling me to walk away. I didn't. I couldn't. I hurried past him, heart racing, and locked myself inside my condo. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know who he was or why he targeted me, but I'll never forget the sound of his knocking, the way it reverberated through the door, the way it echoed in my mind long after he was gone. Some nights when the condo is quiet and the world outside is still, I swear I can still hear it. The knock. There's something about being out on the water that's both calming and unnerving. The vast expanse of a lake, the isolation, the way sound carries across the still surface. It's the kind of place where you can feel completely free yet utterly exposed. I love fishing, especially on remote lakes where it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. But after what happened on that lake a few summers ago, I can't shake the feeling that some places are better left alone. It was late summer, and my friend Mark and I decided to take a trip up to a lake we'd heard about from a couple of locals in the nearby town. It wasn't on any map, just a secluded spot deep in the woods, the kind of place where you wouldn't find another soul for miles. The locals described it as a fisherman's paradise, clear waters, plenty of fish, and best of all, total seclusion. The drive there was long and winding, the kind of road that twists and turns through dense forests, with trees arching over like a tunnel. The sun was setting as we finally reached the lake, casting everything in a warm golden glow. It was even more beautiful than I had imagined, crystal clear water, with the last rays of sunlight sparkling on the surface. The lake was so calm it looked like glass, reflecting the trees and sky perfectly. We set up camp in a small clearing by the shore, our tent facing the water. There was a slight chill in the air, the first sign that summer was coming to an end, but the sky was clear, and the stars were already starting to appear. It was the kind of night that made you glad to be alive, out in nature, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. After setting up camp, we decided to fish for a bit before it got too dark. We pushed our small aluminum boat into the water, the soft splash of the oars breaking the silence. The lake was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water lapping gently against the sides of the boat. It was peaceful, but the silence was almost unsettling, like the whole world was holding its breath. We rowed out to the middle of the lake, where the water was deep and dark. By then, the sun had fully set, and the only light came from the sliver of a moon hanging low in the sky and the faint glow of our lantern. We cast our lines, sitting in companionable silence, waiting for a bite. That's when we noticed him. At first, it was just a shadow on the shore, barely visible in the fading light. I thought it might be a trick of the eye or an animal moving through the trees. But as I looked closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing on the shore, motionless, just watching us. "Hey, Mark," I whispered, trying not to sound alarmed. "Do you see that guy over there?" Mark turned to look, squinting into the darkness. "Yeah, I see him. Weird. You think he's just another camper?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice low, "but I thought we were the only ones out here." Mark shrugged, trying to brush it off. Maybe he's just a local, checking out who's on his lake. We tried to ignore the man and focus on our fishing, but it was hard not to feel uneasy. Every time I glanced over, he was still there, standing perfectly still, just watching. He wasn't holding any fishing gear, no flashlight, nothing. Just standing there in the dark. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. "This is starting to creep me out," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Why is he just standing there?" Mark nodded, his expression serious now. "Yeah, it's weird. Maybe we should head back to camp." I didn't argue. We reeled in our lines and I grabbed the oars, rowing us back to shore. The whole time I kept my eyes on the man, but he didn't move. He just kept watching us, his figure barely visible in the shadows. We reached the shore and quickly dragged the boat onto the bank. Now that we were closer, I could see him better. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair and clothes that looked dirty and ragged. But what struck me most was his face, blank, emotionless, like he was in a trance. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance, both of us thinking the same thing. This guy wasn't just another camper. There was something seriously off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's just get back to the tent," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We started walking back to our campsite, our footsteps quickening. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the man to follow, but he was still there, watching us leave. We made it back to the tent, our nerves on edge. The fire we built earlier had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. We didn't say much, both of us too spooked to talk about what had just happened. The silence of the night seemed to press in on us, the only sound the occasional crackle of the dying fire. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, the blank stare, the way he just stood there, unmoving. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was just some strange local, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. "We should have just asked him what he was doing," Mark said after a long silence, his voice strained. "Maybe he's harmless, just weird." "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. But what if he's not? We both knew the answer to that. The isolation, the darkness, the miles between us and the nearest town, it all added up to a feeling of vulnerability I'd never felt before. We were alone out here, and if something went wrong, there was no one to help us. We tried to distract ourselves by cooking a quick dinner over the fire, but the tension was palpable. Our eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the firelight, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. After dinner, we decided to turn in for the night, hoping sleep would take the edge off our nerves. But as I lay in the tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending shivers down my spine. I listened intently, straining to hear anything unusual. But all I could hear was the wind and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like something gently tapping against the side of the tent. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the sound came again, louder this time, tap, tap, tap. I reached over and shook Mark awake, my hand trembling. "Mark, wake up. Do you hear that?" Mark groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the tapping came again, more insistent. We both froze, our eyes wide with fear. The sound was coming from the side of the tent, right next to where we were sleeping. "Who's out there?" Mark called, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the wind and the rustle of leaves. Then, after a moment of silence, the tapping stopped. We sat there in the dark, holding our breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the only sound was the wind. After what felt like an eternity, Mark grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peeking outside. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the breeze and the faint glow of the moon on the lake. But as Mark shone the flashlight around the campsite, he caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Fresh footprints, leading from the shore to the side of our tent, and then back to the lake. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Someone had been outside our tent, watching us while we slept. We scrambled out of the tent, packing up as quickly as possible. The thought of staying there even another minute was unbearable. As we hastily gathered our gear, I kept glancing toward the lake, half expecting to see the man standing there again. But the shoreline was empty, the water still and silent. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We didn't speak much as we packed, our movements frantic, driven by an overwhelming need to get out of there. The once serene and beautiful lake now felt dangerous, a place we needed to escape from. The drive back to town was tense, the silence in the truck heavy with fear. The road wound through the forest, the trees casting long, dark shadows in the moonlight. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us, but the road remained empty. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway, the lights of town just visible in the distance, that I started to relax. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but the fear lingered, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. We never talked about that night again. We both knew that whatever had happened on that lake, it wasn't something we wanted to relive. But the memory of that night has stayed with me. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know why he was watching us or why he followed us to our tent. But the fear I felt, the feeling of being watched, is something I'll never forget. And though I've tried to put it behind me, the memory of that man and those fresh footprints outside our tent still haunts me. Because sometimes in the middle of nowhere, you're not as alone as you think. I've been a land surveyor for nearly 2 decades now, and I've worked in some pretty remote areas. I've seen it all: wild animals, unpredictable weather, and equipment failures miles from civilization. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered under that bridge in the Arizona desert. It's the kind of experience that sticks with you, gnawing at the edges of your mind, reminding you that out there in the middle of nowhere, you're truly on your own. It was mid-July, the kind of day where the heat presses down on you like a weight, and the sun seems determined to burn everything to a crisp. The Arizona desert stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand, rocks, and scrub brush, with only the occasional cactus to break the monotony. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, the kind of blue that seems to go on forever. I was assigned to survey a bridge that spanned a dry riverbed about 50 miles outside of Phoenix. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was straightforward enough. Check the structural integrity, measure the wear and tear, and make sure it was still up to code. The bridge itself was old, probably built back in the 60s, and hadn't seen much traffic in recent years. It was isolated, far from any town or main road, which made it perfect for someone like me who preferred working alone. I drove my truck down a dusty, narrow road that wound through the desert, the tires kicking up clouds of red dust in my wake. The radio crackled with static, the signal fading in and out as I got farther from civilization. I didn't mind the quiet though. In fact, I relished it. Out here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. I reached the bridge around midday, the sun high in the sky, baking the earth below. I parked my truck on the side of the road, grabbed my gear, and started the routine inspection. The bridge looked worse for wear: rusted metal beams, cracks in the concrete, and a layer of dust and grime that hadn't been disturbed in years. As I moved under the bridge to check the supports, I noticed something unusual: a large dumpster tucked away in the shadows beneath the structure. It was an odd sight, completely out of place in the middle of the desert. I couldn't imagine why anyone would leave a dumpster out here, especially in such a remote location. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The dumpster was old and battered, covered in rust and graffiti. There was a faint, unpleasant odor coming from it, like something had been rotting inside for a long time. I hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted the lid, half expecting to find nothing but old trash. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. Inside the dumpster were piles of tattered clothes, dirty blankets, and what looked like empty food containers. It was clear someone had been living here, using the dumpster as a makeshift shelter. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Among the debris were strange, crude drawings scratched into the metal walls. They depicted distorted faces, twisted bodies, and symbols I didn't recognize. My first thought was that some drifter had taken up residence here, someone down on their luck, using this desolate spot to hide from the world. It wasn't unusual to come across homeless camps in remote areas, but this felt different, more desperate, more unhinged. I backed away from the dumpster, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen enough. I just wanted to finish my inspection and get out of there. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, focusing on the task at hand. But as I worked, I couldn't help but glance back at the dumpster, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from the bridge to the surrounding desert, but I didn't see anyone. The sound stopped, and for a moment there was only the wind whistling through the dry riverbed. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind the dumpster, a man. His clothes were filthy and tattered, his hair wild and matted. He was tall and gaunt, with a crazed look in his eyes. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, then began to move toward me. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. I quickly backed away, trying to keep some distance between us, but he kept coming, his pace quickening with every step. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm just doing my job here. I'll be out of your way in a minute." But he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on me, and there was something in his gaze that sent a wave of fear crashing over me. Something wild, unhinged, like he was barely holding on to reality. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. My truck was parked a few yards away, but the man was between me and it. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The survey, the job, none of that mattered anymore. All I cared about was getting out of there in one piece. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "This is my place," he said, his words slurred and broken. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my tone as calm as I could. "I didn't know. I'll leave right now, okay?" But he didn't stop. He kept coming, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his eyes wild with some emotion I couldn't read. I took another step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The distance between us was closing fast, and I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I reached for the revolver I kept holstered at my side, a precaution I always took when working in remote areas. My hand shook as I pulled it out and aimed it at the man, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Stop," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Don't come any closer." The man froze, his eyes widening as he saw the gun. For a moment I thought he might back down, that he might realize the situation had gone too far. But then he did something I didn't expect. He smiled. A twisted, eerie grin that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's going to help you?" he sneered, taking another step forward. "Out here, you're just as alone as I am." I didn't wait to find out what he meant by that. I fired a warning shot into the ground at his feet, the sound echoing through the empty desert. The man flinched but didn't stop. He kept coming, his smile widening, his eyes gleaming with some dark intent. Panic surged through me. I knew I couldn't take my eyes off him, but I also knew I couldn't stay. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and made a break for it. I sprinted toward my truck, not daring to look back, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I finally managed to start the engine. As I slammed the door shut, I caught one last glimpse of the man standing by the dumpster, watching me with that same eerie smile. I floored the gas pedal and sped down the dusty road, the tires kicking up clouds of sand behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the bridge nothing but a distant memory in the rearview mirror. I never went back to that site. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who sent someone else to finish the job. I don't know what happened to the man under the bridge, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I came too close to something dark, something that could have ended very differently. Even now, I still think about that day. I still see the man's face, that twisted smile, in my nightmares. And every time I find myself in a remote area, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting, watching. The experience under that bridge taught me a lesson I'll never forget. When you're alone in the middle of nowhere, you're vulnerable in ways you can't imagine. The isolation, the emptiness, it plays tricks on your mind, makes you question what's real and what isn't. And sometimes you encounter things that remind you just how thin the line between safety and danger really is. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, remember this story. Stay aware, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe. Because out there, you're on your own, and you never know what might be lurking just out of sight. I'm typically not the paranoid type, but when Clara came into our lives, everything changed. At first, I tried to brush off my discomfort, telling myself it was just the usual unease that comes with someone new in the house. After all, when my dad started dating again, I knew things would be different. It had been just the two of us for years since my mom passed, so having someone else around was bound to feel strange. But Clara was more than just strange. It started with the kind of things you try to convince yourself aren't worth worrying about. The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't think much of it. I was sitting in my room late at night, studying for a history test. The window was cracked open, letting in the cool night air, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I remember the exact moment. I had my headphones on, drowning out the silence with music, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered across the hall near my door. I pulled off my headphones, listening intently, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves outside. It wasn't unusual for my dad to wander the house at night. He had trouble sleeping, especially after my mom's death. I figured it was him passing by, but something didn't sit right. The shadow seemed too small to be my dad. I pushed the thought aside and went back to studying, but the uneasy feeling lingered at the back of my mind. A week later, I ran into Clara in the kitchen at a strange hour. It was around 2 a.m., and I had just come back from a friend's house after studying for exams. I wasn't trying to be sneaky, but as I opened the front door quietly, I didn't expect to see her standing there in the dark. She hadn't noticed me at first. She was by the window, staring out into the backyard. I froze, wondering if she was sleepwalking. Her back was to me, motionless in the dim light from the window. "Clara," I whispered, hesitant. She didn't turn around immediately. In fact, she didn't move at all. A chill crept up my spine. Something about her stillness seemed off. Too rigid. Too unnatural. I tried again, my voice a little louder. "Clara, are you okay?" Finally, she turned, but it was slow, almost mechanical, like she hadn't heard me. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, as if she had just woken up from a deep sleep. "I thought I heard something," she said softly, her voice distant. "Just making sure the windows were closed." That didn't make sense. The windows were already shut. I'd checked them before I left, but I didn't push it. I just nodded and went upstairs, trying to shake off the strange encounter. It wasn't until I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, that I realized how tense I had been. My body seemed to know something was wrong before my mind could catch up. Over the next few days, Clara's strange behavior became harder to ignore. She was always around, hovering in the background. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid, but even my dad started to notice. He mentioned once or twice that she seemed a little off. Sometimes she would disappear into rooms for long periods or stand by the windows at odd hours, staring at nothing. One night during dinner, she suddenly stood up mid-bite and walked into the hallway without saying a word. My dad and I exchanged a look, but he just shrugged, trying to make light of it. "She's probably just tired," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. A few days later, I had another unsettling encounter with Clara. It was a Saturday, and I had spent most of the day in my room, avoiding everyone. Being around Clara made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside my room. They stopped right by my door and then nothing, just silence. I sat up in bed, staring at the door. Maybe it was my dad checking on me, but something told me it wasn't him. I held my breath, listening. The house was dead quiet. After what felt like forever, the footsteps continued, moving slowly down the hall toward the staircase. I crept out of bed and peeked into the hallway. There she was, Clara. She was standing at the top of the stairs, facing the wall. Her back was to me, and she was completely still again, like she was waiting for something or someone. Nausea rose in my throat. What the hell was she doing? I wanted to say something, to call out to her, but fear clamped my throat shut. I retreated back into my room, closing the door softly and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was she sleepwalking? Was she losing it? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Clara standing at the top of the stairs, waiting. The next morning, I tried to talk to my dad about it. I told him about the footsteps, about Clara standing in the dark, not moving. He just sighed, rubbing his temples like he was too tired to deal with it. "Look, she's been through a lot," he said. "Maybe she's just adjusting." give her some time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Clara wasn't just acting strange. There was something deeply wrong with her, and I felt like I was the only one who could see it. A week later, things took a turn for the worse. It was the middle of the night again, and I woke up with the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. My room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I squinted into the shadows, and that's when I saw her. Clara was standing in the doorway, perfectly still. My heart pounded frantically in my chest. She was just standing there, watching me. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out. She didn't respond, didn't move. I could see the faint glint of her eyes in the darkness fixed on me. "Clara, what are you doing?" I said again, louder. Slowly, she stepped into the room, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. She walked over to the window, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she reached out and shut it. "You left the window open," she said, her voice monotone. But I hadn't. I hadn't touched it since the morning. Panic rose in my chest as she turned back toward me, her face blank, her eyes cold. I wanted to scream, to tell her to get out, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just sat there trembling. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, me frozen in bed and her standing by the window, watching me with that unsettling gaze. Finally, she turned and left the room, closing the door behind her without a word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the door, waiting for her to come back. The next morning, I confronted my dad again. I told him everything, about Clara standing in my room, about her closing the window, about the footsteps outside my door at night. But he didn't believe me. He said I was overreacting, reading too much into things. "She's not a threat," he insisted. "She's just different. Give her a break." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong with Clara. A few days later, she was gone. No warning, no explanation. My dad just came home one night and said she had left. Said she needed space, time to figure things out. He didn't seem surprised, just resigned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really gone. Not completely. Sometimes I wake up with the feeling that someone is watching me from the shadows. And sometimes when I look out my bedroom window, I swear I see her standing in the yard, watching the house. I haven't told my dad. He wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know Clara's still out there. I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys a quiet night in. After a long week at work, there's nothing better than kicking back in my small apartment, ordering takeout, and watching something to unwind. That night was no different. Though I made a decision I would come to regret, I picked a horror movie. It wasn't even one of those cheesy, predictable ones. No, this movie was the kind that gets under your skin, you know. The kind that doesn't rely on cheap jump scares but slowly digs its way into your brain, making you question every little sound or shadow in your room. By the time the credits rolled, I was feeling that deep-rooted paranoia, that creeping sensation that you're not as alone as you think. I was about to shake it off, chalk it up to the late hour and the unnerving atmosphere of the movie, when I heard it, a faint creak. The kind of sound you'd hear if someone shifted their weight on an old floorboard. At first I didn't move. I just sat there on the couch, remote still in my hand, eyes flicking to the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. The sound didn't come again. I let out a slow breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than my overactive imagination. But you know how it is after a scary movie, every tiny noise feels like a sign of something more sinister. I told myself it was probably the building settling. It was an old apartment after all, nothing unusual about a few creaks here and there. I stood up, stretching my muscles, still tense from sitting on the edge of my seat for nearly 2 hours. The clock read 12 a.m. Not too late, but late enough that the entire building seemed to be asleep. No sound of TVs through the thin walls, no footsteps from the hallway, just the hum of my fridge in the distance. I walked over to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, flipping the switch as I entered. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. I took a drink, feeling the cold water soothe the lingering tension in my throat. Everything was normal, but still that unease clung to me like a second skin. And then I heard it again. That creak, only this time it was louder. I stopped mid-sip, ears straining to catch the direction it was coming from. It wasn't the hallway. It was closer. Much closer. Slowly, I lowered the glass and took a step toward the living room, peeking around the corner. Nothing. Just the faint light from the TV, its screen now black, casting a dull glow across the room. My heart picked up pace, an involuntary reaction, though I tried to force myself to stay calm. I checked the front door, reassured by the sight of the deadbolt securely in place. The window was shut, the curtains drawn. I was alone, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I turned back to the kitchen, intending to finish my water and get ready for bed, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I jumped stupid. I know, but I couldn't help it. I grabbed it, more to reassure myself that everything was fine than anything else. It was just a notification from one of those apps. Nothing important. That's when I heard the third creak. This one was unmistakable, coming from the hallway again, but louder, heavier. It sounded like someone was there, taking careful steps. Every inch of my skin crawled with a kind of dread that you can't explain or rationalize. I moved toward the hallway slowly and peeked around the corner. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but someone was there. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stood at the far end of the hall near my bedroom door. I froze. My mouth went dry, heart hammering in my chest. For a second, I thought maybe I was still caught in the lingering effects of the movie, that I was imagining things. But then the figure shifted. It moved. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct was to reach for my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly. My breath came out shallow, my mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, none of them good. I didn't want to shout or make any noise. I didn't know how this person got into my apartment, but the last thing I wanted was to provoke them. I took a step back, praying the floor wouldn't creak under my weight. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, staring into the darkness of my bedroom. I wasn't close enough to make out any details, just a silhouette, but it was definitely a woman. Her long hair fell down her back, and she was dressed in what looked like a jacket and jeans. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak out. No response, no movement, just silence. I took another step back, feeling sweat trickle down my spine. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But then she spoke, her voice low, as if she was repeating something she'd said 1,000 times. "I need to get my things." The words didn't make sense. Her things. What things? I stood there, my back pressed against the wall now, struggling to process what was happening. Was she lost? Was she confused? I hadn't seen her before, not in the building or anywhere else. "You're in the wrong apartment," I said, my voice trembling. For a moment I thought she didn't hear me. She didn't react at all, just stood there, her head tilted slightly. Then, slowly, she turned to face me. That's when I saw her eyes wide, unblinking, like she was in some kind of trance. My stomach dropped. There was something deeply wrong about the way she looked at me, something that made my skin crawl. She didn't belong here. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. "I need to get my things," she repeated, taking a step toward me. That's when I panicked. "You need to leave," I stammered, my voice rising in pitch. "This isn't your apartment." She didn't stop. She kept walking, her footsteps heavy, like she was moving with a purpose I couldn't understand. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I call the police? But my phone was still on the counter, and she was between me and the door. In that moment, I didn't know what else to do. I turned and bolted for the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it just as I heard her footsteps stop outside the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. For what felt like hours, I stood there waiting, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Eventually, I heard footsteps again, this time retreating down the hallway. The front door clicked open, then closed. I waited, counting the seconds, unsure if she was really gone. When I finally worked up the courage to step out of the bathroom, the apartment was empty. The front door was still locked, the deadbolt in place. No sign of her anywhere. I don't know how she got in. I don't know why she was there. All I know is that when I went upstairs the next day to check with my neighbor, he told me his ex-girlfriend had been by earlier that night, trying to get back some things she'd left behind months ago. But she was gone now, or at least that's what he said.